The JCC is committed to giving our community the opportunity to hear a variety of perspectives on current events. However, we do want you to know that the views and opinions expressed by our session leaders do not necessarily reflect the official position of the JCC. We're also committed to facilitating civil dialogue, so the Zoom chat will be open for this session. But please remember to be civil and to communicate with the respect everyone, including those that we disagree with, deserve. I'm very excited to introduce tonight's presenter, Bret Stephens, who began working as an opinion columnist for the New York Times in April 2017 and as a senior contributor to NBC News in June 2017. He is the author of America in Retreat, The New Isolationism and the Coming Global Disorder, released in November 2014, and is the recipient of numerous awards and distinctions, including 2 honorary doctorates and the 2013 Pulitzer Prize for Commentary. Bret, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Well, Cheryl, I hope you can hear me. I hope technology is working, and welcome everyone to my somewhat messy study. One of the funny aspects of this new world we're in, and perhaps hopefully leaving soon, is that it manages to achieve a different level of intimacy. So let me assure all of you that I'm also wearing my pants. I have become pretty good at speaking via Zoom, or at least pretty experienced with it. And one of the things that I think I've learned, Cheryl, is that people's attention spans naturally tend to wane when someone on their screen is droning on for a little too long. And they absolutely collapse when a lecture is being read to them via a Zoom screen. So I promise I'm going to do neither of those things. I'm going to try to keep my remarks relatively short. I am going to touch on, by necessity, events of the last 7 days. I think that is on the minds of everyone, and I'm going to touch on those first. And then I'm going to get, at least briefly, to the theme of the evening on anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, and where the two meet. What I hope I can do, Cheryl, is allow for a lot of questions, because I think people really, that's the most interactive, the most enjoyable, the most productive aspects of these evenings. So I'll try to reserve the balance of time for the Q&A section. But let me begin by just making a few relatively general remarks about the events that we have seen unfold in Gaza and in Israel over the last several days. And what I want to focus on in particular is how, assuming this is an overwhelmingly Jewish audience, how we should, as American Jews, approach what is happening between Israelis and Palestinians. And the first thing that invariably comes up is whether we have a right at moments like this to criticize. And I want to emphasize that, in my view, we always have not just a right, we have a responsibility to criticize. But before we criticize, we have to, I think, pass what I think are 4 distinct tests, which are the kind of the entry into making criticisms that are not only legitimate, but are potentially valuable, that are part of a genuine conversation that can actually produce more light than heat. So what are those 4 tests that I'd like to suggest to you this evening? The first test is the test of empathy. The second test is the test of good faith. The third is the test of historical understanding. And the fourth is the test of moral clarity and just some basic common sense. Let me begin with the first test, which is the test of empathy. You know, about a year ago or so, since this is the Meyerson JCC, a number of hotels in your neck of the woods, the Upper West Side of Manhattan, became for a period of time shelters for homeless people. The Lucerne Hotel was one of the hotels. There were a few others around 79th, 78th Street. And one of these hotels, at least there was a moment, excuse me, one of these hotels, there was a moment when it turned out that sex offenders, violent sex offenders, were being housed in one of them. And the reason I mention this is when we think about the test of empathy, I think we have to begin with what I'm calling a little bit imprecisely the Lucerne Standard, which is that if people were unnerved, people in the JCC, in your JCC's neck of the woods, were unnerved when landmarks in the neighborhood were not just used by homeless people, but in at least one case by people with violent or disturbing histories. If that unnerved you in your neighborhood, then you have to apply, or you ought to apply, a similar test to what Israelis are experiencing now in their neighborhoods. Let's just imagine that rather than having people who simply have the misfortune of being homeless, or people who have violent or criminal histories, having them housed in a hotel, let's imagine a different scenario where in your neighborhood around 79th Street, there is a hotel in which people have AK-47s or assault rifles and fire them off occasionally at passersby. They have RPGs and also are from time to time prepared to fire those in random directions. And beyond that kind of violence, which is aimed indiscriminately, they are also insisting that in addition to a right to stay in that hotel, they'd also like to take over your apartment buildings, your flats. Add one more feature to this scenario, which is that unfortunately you don't have an option to go to the Hamptons, you don't have an option to go up to Rhinebeck. You have to stay put where you are, because it's not entirely clear that any other place in the United States wants to take you. So you have to live in that situation. If that's the situation that you are faced with, what are you going to do? I am not insisting that there is an answer, but what I am trying to do is offer a sense of what it means to live in a country where you are living under constant, deadly, and in many ways entirely random threats from a very near neighbor. When you can begin to at least try to enter into the life of everyday Israelis, never mind in Sderot, also in Jerusalem, in Ramat Gan, in Ashkelon, in Ashdod, in Beersheba, who have to live under this kind of threat, when you can actually spend some time and think, that's what life must be like, then you might begin to pass what I think is the first test. You might begin to understand what Israelis have been dealing with every single day and night of the last week. Now, the second test that I'd offer is the good faith test. That is, do you have at least sufficient, a minimal faith in Israel, in its methods and in its war aims, to give them the benefit of believing that they are operating in good faith. I've seen so much evidence in the last several days that people don't believe this, and it's not just in the United States. It's in Israel. It's the suggestion that somehow the Prime Minister of Israel, think of him what you will, and I've been very critical of him from time to time in my columns, has almost, the suggestion goes, almost engineered this crisis in order to save his position as prime minister, save himself from a trial and potential criminal liabilities, criminal problems. Another aspect of the good faith test is the idea, is whether you actually believe that Israel is doing everything it can to minimize civilian casualties on the other side, on the Palestinian side. And of course, again, you hear a lot of talk from all kinds of quarters, including in the Jewish community itself, that suggests that Israel is almost wantonly targeting Palestinian civilians, Palestinian children, that this is part of its aim. Now, if you actually believe that, you at least have to honestly address what I think is a fairly logical question, which is that if Israel is in fact deliberately targeting civilians, is in fact trying to kill innocent children, then why doesn't it kill many more? All of us who are in this chat know very well that Israel has the military wherewithal to kill not scores, not hundreds, not thousands, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Israel is a very powerful military country. So you at least ought to ask yourself, if you're going to enter into a serious conversation about what Israel is doing, do you have a sufficient sense of good faith in Israel's leadership, in the purity of arms, that they are not trying to kill wantonly innocent Palestinian lives? If you don't, please answer the question, why aren't Israelis in fact killing many more Palestinians, thousands of Palestinians? The third test, as I mentioned, is the test of historical understanding. You know, I've been thinking about this as a column, but there's something that reminds me that there's a kind of there was an old movie with Jim Carrey called, what was it? The Spotless, the Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. And there's a kind of eternal sunshine and a spotless mind of the way in which a lot of people look at these intermittent crises between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. It's as if they don't remember. There is no prior history to what came before. So there's no memory of the fact that this is the fourth war, major war that Hamas has started since it violently took over the Gaza Strip in a confrontation with its political rivals in Fatah in 2007. There is no memory of the fact that since Hamas came to power, it has done nothing except use all of the resources that are available to it to construct a vast network of tunnels, not just within Gaza, but crossing over into Israel. There is no memory of the fact that Israel has tried to constantly supply Gaza with at least basic humanitarian aid that has not impeded the flow of financial funds to Gaza. There is no memory of the fact that in 2005, Ariel Sharon withdrew every settler and every settlement from Gaza. There is no memory of the fact that in that same withdrawal, he also withdrew Israeli forces from the so-called Philadelphia corridor, the strip of land separating the Gaza Strip from Egypt. So when you sort of divorce what's happening from all previous historical context, you can say, well, why is Israel acting this way? You know, what are its motives? But Israelis do not have the luxury, they do not have the possibility of operating in a historical vacuum. And so a sense of historical understanding is, I think, central to, again, being part of a serious conversation about what Israel should or should not be doing in this conflict, in the immediate, in the short run, the medium run, or in the long run. And finally, my fourth point, which has to do with moral clarity and some common sense. If Israel, as mentioned earlier, that if Israel wanted to destroy the Gaza Strip, it is within its military means to do so. But Israel is systematically trying to minimize civilian casualties. On the opposite side, the only reason why the fatality figures are disproportionate isn't a matter of intention on Hamas's part. Hamas wants to kill as many Israelis as they possibly can. It's simply a matter of capability. When Israel, or should Israel, win this war, the Gaza Strip will still be almost certainly under Hamas's rule. It will not be under Israeli rule. If Hamas were to achieve all of its military aims, right, it wouldn't simply mean the end of so-called Israeli occupation in the Gaza Strip or even the West Bank. It would mean the end of Israel itself. It would mean its total eradication. And these are judgments that people have to make. People have to make, when people start talking about war crimes, why is it that we never mention the fact that it is a war crime to emplace military installations, headquarters, arsenals, weapons depots, and so on in densely populated civilian areas? That ought to be part of this conversation. Whatever view you take of the wisdom of Israel's course, that basic moral sense that what Hamas is doing is deliberately endangering Palestinian lives in order to achieve propagandistic purposes has to be part of that, very basic conversation. Now, this brings me to a few remarks about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And I just want to, again, keep my remarks reasonably general. I think that what a lot of people, or one of the problems with conversations about anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is that a lot of people, and I'm going to say this a little provocatively, a lot of people, particularly on the left, tend to misunderstand what those two terms actually mean. Let me start with anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism is not criticism of Israel. You can and you should, and in many cases, you must criticize Israel in 100 different ways. Israel requires honest criticism, okay? So let's remove this canard that somehow people like me will say that it's anti-Semitic to criticize Israel. It's not only not anti-Semitic to criticize Israel, it's the essence of Judaism, as I understand it, to criticize yourself or to criticize the things that you like, you admire, you wish to preserve, you wish to improve. Anti-Zionism is the rejection of the idea of a Jewish state in one way or the other. It calls not for Israel to change, it calls for Israel not to exist. Now, how the end of Israel might come about is a debate that anti-Zionists have among themselves, whether it's violent or gradual. But anti-Zionism is a call for the elimination of an entire state. Now, this is unique. Nobody calls for the elimination, nobody as far as I know, well, perhaps in some places, but certainly no one in the United States, as far as I know, calls for the elimination of Pakistan. Nobody calls for the elimination of Zimbabwe. Nobody calls for the elimination of Slovakia. Maybe there's some Czechs who believe the elimination of Slovakia. I tend to doubt it. But only when we really talk about the sort of major themes of public discourse today, the only state in the world whose existence is regularly called into question is Israel. That itself is remarkable. Now, people will say, well, the reason that happens is that Israel is occupying another nation, or what ought to be another state. That's the argument. That's a perfectly legitimate argument, or well, let me rephrase that. That is an argument that one can have. But I don't see anyone calling for the elimination of Turkey because it occupies northern Cyprus. I don't see anyone calling for the elimination of India because, at least according to some people, it occupies Kashmir. I don't see people calling for the elimination of Morocco because, again, according to many people, it occupies the territory known as the Western Sahara. I don't see people calling for the elimination of Russia because it's currently occupying large tranches of large areas of Ukraine. So the suggestion that Israel is in a different category because it behaves in a uniquely invidious way simply doesn't stand the test of ordinary, easy scrutiny and review compared to other states. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that this is not just unique, but it's unique and uniquely invidious and awful, even if there were no connection between anti-Zionism and hatred of Jews. There are 10 million or so Israeli citizens in the world today. If Israel were to somehow vanish, if Israel as a state were to go away, what would become of those 10 million people? What would become of their, never mind of their physical existence, what about their desire to live in a Jewish state, in the state of Israel? Anti-Zionism itself is a wretched point of view that, as far as I can tell, applies to no other state in the world. And maybe this gets me back to the first point that I made about empathy. If you're not willing to deny yourself as an American your own American citizenship, then how are you in a position to make that call or make that demand of Israelis to somehow will themselves out of existence? Now, this brings me to the second issue, which is about anti-Semitism. I am I have a very mixed feelings about the term anti-Semitism, which I think as most of you on this call know, it's not exactly a neologism, but it's a term of art that came around only in the 1870s and 1880s, thanks to a German anti-Semite named Wilhelm Marr. It is a specifically 19th century term. But people, again, and this tends to be, I think, particularly pronounced on the left, people tend to think that anti-Semitism is a form of racism against Jews. And that's only partially correct. Anti-Semitism specifically is a racialized form of Jew hatred. But there are multiple forms of Jew hatred. It's entirely possible for a Jew hater to see nothing racially unique about Jews, but hate Jews for their religion, hate Jews for their ethnicity, hate Jews for their alleged financial successes, hate Jews because they're rootless cosmopolitans, hate Jews because they're supposedly settlers and colonizers in a land that's not their own, or what anti-Zionism is, hate Jews because far from being rootless cosmopolitans, they are rooted nationalists. So anti-Semitism is, as I said, just part of a broader family of Jew hatreds. And it's easy to understand, and it's frequently the case that people on the left reject the racialized view of Jew hatred without understanding that other forms of Jew hatred are more enduring, and in many cases, at least today, even more toxic than the anti-Semitism that people witnessed back in 2017 in places like Charlottesville, Virginia. Now, it is true, and this is a debate that I frequently have with people like Peter Beinart. It is true that there are people who are committed anti-Zionists who are genuinely not anti-Semitic. There are obviously, even within especially religious Jewish communities, strident anti-Zionists who, for theological, or Jews who are strident anti-Zionists, in spite of obviously being extremely observant Jews. There are always exceptions to rules. But we really have to ask ourselves why it is that the kind of hatreds that we see being expressed as versions of anti-Zionism seem to track so peculiarly well with classic expressions of Jew hatred. And let me just give you a few examples. One example is the idea that Israel could end the occupation and the suffering of the Palestinian right now if it wanted to, but that it chooses not to do so. This is the idea that Jewish evil is not somehow accidental or partial, but that it's total, that it is a willfully demonic exercise by an entire people in the oppression of another people. Another example that comes to mind, especially now, is the notion that Israel is deliberately killing Palestinian civilians, including children, because somehow it suits its fancy. I think this replicates the idea of a blood libel, which is, as most of you know, at least 1,000 years old. A third notion, that Israel is deliberately stealing Palestinian land, which is an issue which has come up with the controversy over the homes in Sheikh Jarrah. This idea of Jewish greed, right, now is translated into Zionist greed. What used to be Jewish greed for money is now Zionist greed for land. But again, the map is the mapping of the two hatreds is uncannily similar. And finally, the idea that Israel is a unique evil and a threat to world peace, that somehow, were it not for Israel and its conflict with the Palestinians, all other problems would be solved. Again, the idea that somehow if you eliminate Jews from the map and from the map of human conflict, it would achieve some kind of miraculous transformation in terms of the state of the world. Anyone who looks at what's happening in Israel objectively, even taking the dimmest view of Israel's behavior, knows that it pales in comparison to what is happening in any number of places, even within the region. Turkey vis-a-vis Syria, Iran vis-a-vis its minorities, Yemen, go down the list. But this idea that Israel somehow represents a unique evil and a unique problem in the world, again, uncannily resembles traditional forms of Jewish hatred. Now, again, I said earlier, it's not a perfect similarity. Similarly, one might argue that during the era of Jim Crow, there might have been segregationists who were not racists. Possible, theoretically possible. I'm sure one could find a few examples. But anyone with eyes to see understood how one mapped with the other. To be a segregationist was, in fact, to be a racist. To offer segregationist views was a polite way of expressing racial hatreds. Now, I'm just going to conclude with one thought for you, which is, we have come as a people, Jews have come as a people a little too far to be to be fooled, to be naive. There's a wonderful scene in a book that has meant a lot to me in the last few years, a book called Not I, which was by a German historian named Joachim Fest, who recounted his childhood as the son of a committed anti-Nazi in Berlin in the 1930s during the earlier, during the entire Nazi period. And his father, although Catholic, was a tremendous admirer of German Jews. And there's a wonderful scene in the book in which the son remembers that his father is talking about Germany's Jews. And he says, that the German Jews were in some ways the best of the Germans, the most cultivated and civilized and funny, extols the virtue of German Jewry. And then the father concludes by saying they had just one flaw, which is that living in tolerant, pluralistic, law-abiding Prussia, I think this is an exact quote, he said they had lost their instinct for danger, which had preserved them through the ages. And what I'd close with this thought tonight, which is that here in America and in the West, we cannot lose our instinct for danger. In London, today or yesterday, a caravan of cars drove through Finchley and Golders Green and other Jewish areas of North London, broadcasting from loudspeakers, "Fuck the Jews, rape their daughters." That happened in London just today or yesterday. We cannot afford in the tolerant West to lose our instinct for danger, which has preserved us through the ages. And I hope we don't do so in the crisis that Israel and all the Jews are confronting today. So with that, I'm open to questions.
Thank you so much, Bret. That was really informative. And the chat has been bustling, as they say. And I want to first ask one question that's come up a number of times in a number of different ways. And it's something like this. The question is, isn't it extremists on both sides that are causing the challenges in Israel? I'm curious what you'd say to that.
Well, thanks for the question. And look, there is absolutely no doubt that there is extremism in Israeli society. There is no doubt that there are Jewish perpetrators in mob violence against Arabs. There is no doubt that there are ugly elements, hideous and fascistic elements, I should say, in Israeli politics today. Israel is not a nation of saints. It's not a nation of saints. And that has to be acknowledged. And I think it's for all of us who are Jews, not only to acknowledge it, but to be horrified by it, right? To be horrified by it. But it also makes a difference. It also makes a difference when you have a government that is condemning Jewish violence against Arab life, that is prosecuting Jewish violence against Arab life. Some of the worst moments for Israel, I think, in the last several years, is when those prosecutions have not been carried out as forcefully as they should. So we absolutely owe it to ourselves, and we owe it to our cousins in Israel to point that out and point how much that hurts Israeli society. But I know very few Israelis, and I know hundreds of Israelis, who aren't horrified by the reality and the existence of those elements. But there's also a very basic moral difference between a country that is a flawed country with capricious, self-interested leaders who I wouldn't necessarily vote for, right? I probably wouldn't vote for this time or the last four occasions, and a society that is being run by a terrorist organization whose aim is to wipe their neighbors off the map. There is a basic difference between a military which when it kills or injures civilians, does it accidentally, and a group like Hamas that when it kills or injures civilians, does so entirely deliberately. There is a difference between blunders and crimes. And those are very basic differences. So I'm not happy with the idea of like extremists on both sides as a kind of a trope, because it buries some very basic moral differences between a society that in the end is a serious and law-abiding country that is trying to live up, failing sometimes, but trying to live up to certain kinds of moral ideas in conditions of political, socioeconomic, and military stress. And another group that aims not only to eliminate its rivals, but also to tyrannize its own people. And this is a point that I just want to expatiate on a little bit more. There is not enough talk, there is not enough discussion in the Jewish community about what Hamas does to the Palestinian people. There is not enough of a discussion about the absence of, never mind democracy, any kind of liberalism, any kind of rights for Palestinians, and the fact that those are rights that are being denied by Palestinian leaders, not just Mahmoud Abbas in the 16th year of his elected 4-year term of office, but by Hamas. Where are women's rights under Hamas? Where are the rights of the LGBTQ community under Hamas? Those are important and legitimate questions. And we owe it to ourselves to hold our enemies and our adversaries to the same set of standards.
Thanks. So I want to ask you, the next question is a bit different. Sorry, I'm scrolling through the chat here. Things are going very quickly. And there's a question here that asks, what is your opinion of the New York Times coverage of Israel and anti-Semitism?
My opinion is that I'm doing my very best to provide an independent perspective that reflects more than 22 years of experience covering the conflict. And I am going to speak for myself, and I will say only that I have hundreds, or if not, thousands of colleagues who are also doing their best under trying circumstances to bring you the news. So that's my comment.
Thank you. All right, going in a different direction, how much do you attribute the timing of what's happening now to the Biden administration?
Before I answer that, I also want to say this. I want to give the Times a lot of credit for being a paper that actually has multiple perspectives. And, people like my friend, Nick Kristof, and I disagree on all kinds of things. Nick is an amazing writer and reporter. And I think that our lives as New Yorkers are enriched by the fact that they can open a paper and get different points of view. We have too many media organizations which really only offer one point of view. And I think it's a credit to the Times that it offers a voice like mine, which I know is not always the sweetest to some of the paper's regular readers. Now, to your question about the Biden administration, that's very hard to say, but I will say this as a person who is associated with the political right, at least some of the time, which is that so far I give the Biden administration full marks in making the essential moral point that Israel has a right and in fact a duty to defend itself, and has not instantly jumped on the bandwagon of hectoring Israel when its own civilians are in bunkers, living in fear of random rockets falling in their neighborhood.
All right.
I may change that view soon, but for now, I'm giving them credit.
Okay, great. And then a related but different question, how about the timing related to Netanyahu wishing to stay in power?
Well, again, I think look, I was the editor of the Jerusalem Post for a number of years. It all seems, if you're of a conspiratorial frame of mind, eerily convenient that Netanyahu, who on a week ago Sunday seemed like he was really finally on his way out the door as prime minister, suddenly, because of this crisis, has a renewed lease on political life. The reality is that the elements which went into making this crisis were brewing for quite a long time. I actually don't think the main issue is what was happening in Sheikh Jarrah or even on the Temple Mount with the policing around Ramadan and so on. I think the timing that people should pay attention to is the cancellation of Palestinian elections. Because a lot of what Hamas is doing is bidding for political supremacy within the Palestinian Authority, and doing so at the expense of Palestinian and Israeli civilians alike.
Thank you. There are a few questions here about what it will take to move forward. So what do you see as the most realistic best case scenario for a peaceful future?
Look, realistic is the operative word there, right? I don't see Israel having the will or desire to conduct a long campaign. But what I do think that Israel wants to achieve is a decisive military blow against Hamas, which restores essential elements of deterrence for several years. These wars seem to come, we had one in 2009, brief one in 2012, then in 2014, then this long, relatively long seven-year lull. And I think that if I were the Prime Minister of Israel, I would be thinking in that frame. How do you sufficiently deter Hamas and impose not just military costs, but also political costs, so it's clear that this gambit of theirs was a failure? And in the meantime, my whole view has been that the way in which you reach peace is not from the inside out, that is to say, resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the hopes that you then resolve Israel's wider problems in the region. It's from the outside in. That's, I think, the logic of the Abraham Accords, which is make peace with the United Arab Emirates, even though there's no territorial issue, with Bahrain, hopefully with Kuwait, hopefully with Oman, ideally, ultimately with Saudi Arabia, so that you reach a position where most of the Arab world lives in peace with Israel. And it's the Palestinians who seem, from a political point of view, as the atavism in Arab politics, as opposed to the vanguard of Arab politics. So I think pressing forward on the dynamic that has been created by the Abraham Accords is essentially the right way to go. And I would add, by the way, that part of, I think, what Hamas is doing is trying to sever the links that were established by the Abraham Accords, or at least to stress them, which is another reason why, in the broad scheme of things, if Israel can achieve its immediate military goals of deterring and penalizing Hamas, it should look to end the conflict sooner rather than later. We don't want to strain the kind of relationships that Israel has established with important outer periphery Arab states.
Do you think that Iran has played any role in the current conflict?
I was waiting for that question. So that's an essential aspect of this, which is, by the way, speaking of fantastic Times reporting, the Times had a very good story on how is it that Palestinians have been able to amass an arsenal estimated at 30,000 or so rockets, many of them with intermediate or at least ranges sufficient to reach Jerusalem. And the answer is Iran. Iranian funding, Iranian technology, Iranian know-how, Iranian supplies, and so on. And Iran has every interest in stressing Israel on its southern front, while Israel is stressing Iran on its northern front in Syria and Lebanon. So that cannot be you cannot see the two separately. Iran is using Hamas as a Sunni proxy, just as it uses Hezbollah as a Shiite proxy. And it's one of the reasons why, whatever else happens with the JCPOA or renewing the JCPOA, we cannot forget that Iran poses the single greatest threat, regional threat to peace and stability.
One thing that's different from prior conflicts with Gaza, Arab Israelis seem to take increasing part. What is your view on this new situation?
Well, that's obviously hugely worrying. It's hugely worrying. And by the way, again, we talk about criticizing Israel. Has Israel been scandalously lax in not working to fully integrate Arab Israelis into Israeli society? The answer, of course, is yes. This is a real problem, and people have been talking about it for ages. Now, what I've seen so far, despite what's happened in Akko and Ramla and other cities, strikes me as at the peripheries of Arab-Israeli society, not the center of it, which I think wants to integrate and understands the value of being in a state like Israel as opposed to being elsewhere. But should this light a fire under Israel to have the kind of awakening that to some extent we've seen here in the United States when it comes to race relations? Of course it has, or of course it should. And that's, by the way, that is where, criticism, insistent criticism, is actually valuable coming from American Jews. The continued disparities, for instance, in terms of the quality of policing between Jewish Israeli communities and Arab Israeli communities, that's a scandal, and that has to be addressed. And Israel is going to need a government that is going to make that and put that at the top of its political agenda. That hasn't happened. So lest anyone think that I'm incapable of criticizing Israel, this is a vast field for criticism. I'm on the advisory board of the Israel Democracy Institute, which is a great organization. And they've been doing a lot of work in this field, and we need more of it.
There's another question here that asks about the conditions in Gaza. There are those that feel that deterrence will only work long term if Gaza is allowed to thrive in some degree of independence. Do you agree with that, and how might that happen?
Look, I have been to Gaza, I don't know, 20 times or so. The idea that Gaza is a uniquely horrible place just doesn't stand up to scrutiny. Gaza is, sure, if you come from, if you wake up in the morning in Ramat Gan and go into Gaza, it's considerably worse. But I've also spent a lot of time in the Nile River Delta, just 100 or so miles away in Egypt. Compare a city like Mansoura in Egypt to Gaza, and Gaza compares actually relatively favorably. And I think a point, one of the things I mentioned in my column is just the breathtaking cynicism of Hamas. If Hamas were really serious about economic improvement in Gaza, they wouldn't be devoting billions, a huge share of their GDP, to building a network of tunnels either under the border with Israel or under Gaza itself. They wouldn't be taking all of the pipes that they've recovered from Israeli agricultural settlements from before 2005 and repurposing them to build rockets. They wouldn't be firing rockets in Israel in the certainty that there's going to be the kind of retaliation that we've seen that has destroyed so much Palestinian infrastructure. So obviously, it would be great to see economic development occur in Gaza, but economic development is not going to occur while the Strip remains under the control of a terrorist organization that sees Gaza as nothing more than a staging ground for launching war on its neighbors and tyrannizing its own people. About a year or two ago, there were massive protests in Gaza, and I was scandalized by how little attention they received in the Western press. This has to become part of the conversation. It has to become part of the conversation that the people who most oppress ordinary Gazans are their illegitimate and violent rulers in Hamas.
Thanks. I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I take too long with my answers.
No, it's okay. There's a question asking for a little bit more information about the conversation we had earlier about the Palestinian Authority. How have West Bank Arabs and the Palestinian Authority reacted? Is Hamas making a political ploy against the Palestinian Authority to gain popular support with this action?
Yeah, well, that's exactly what's happening. Which is you have a sclerotic Palestinian Authority under the rule of an 85-year-old or 86-year-old Mahmoud Abbas, who has systematically eliminated some of his potential political rivals within Fatah, or actually even outside of Fatah, to create this situation where it's sort of either him or Hamas. And given that choice, it's likely that Hamas might be the much more popular option. Remember, Hamas won popular elections back in 2006. And again, legitimate criticism of Israel. Did it do enough to shore up Palestinian moderates like Salam Fayyad back when he was prime minister in, 10, 12 or 13 years ago? Probably it did not. But it goes to the point that I made earlier about empathy. If you're an ordinary Israeli and you notice that you vacated, or your country entirely vacated a territory, the Gaza Strip, and it led not to more peace and more opportunity, but to more violence and a greater threat level, you're going to have to think twice about vacating about the suggestion that you should vacate the West Bank if it's overwhelmingly likely that Hamas will become the dominant political entity, which is why I said in my column on Friday, if you want peace, you want to see Hamas routed. Israelis and Palestinians alike deserve Palestinian leadership that wants to live in peace with all its neighbors for the benefit of all of its citizens.
Thank you so much, Bret. This was really an interesting and insightful conversation. To everyone who included and added their thoughts and opinions and questions into the chat, thank you for doing so. I'm sorry I didn't have a chance to ask all of the questions. There were many, many of them, and clearly we could have a much longer program. But thank you all. We will be going to our next session in just a few minutes, but in the meantime, everyone is welcome to have a stretch, and we will be back momentarily.